Hi everyone, welcome. We'll just give it another minute or so to give people a chance to log on. Okay, I think we can get started and people will continue to join. Welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you. Thank you for joining. My name is Nazifa Wazirzada and I'm the program coordinator here at Global Rights for Women. And we'd like to start off this webinar with a land acknowledgement. So we gratefully acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before even the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and with staff throughout Minnesota, we acknowledge that we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that have been inflicted upon Indigenous people globally. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women here in Minnesota and in many places around the world. So please join us now in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can join the effort to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. And also, since people are joining here from around the world, at this time, if you would like to, please put into the chat what land you are acknowledging, and we would appreciate it. Thank you. So like I mentioned earlier, thank you so much for coming to Global Rights for Women's Conversation Series, Valiant Voices. Like I said, I'm Nazifa Wazirzada, the program coordinator for Global Rights for Women, an organization founded in 2014 to end domestic and sexual violence around the world. Valiant Voices is a conversation series created by Global Rights for Women that features the human rights advocates and survivors addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are the stories of powerful leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. We will be live streaming this on Facebook today, and we welcome your comments there or here in the chat on Zoom. And Laura Wilson, Global Rights for Women's human rights attorney, will be monitoring the chat. And after the conversation, we will also be sending out a link with the recording to this webinar, so you can view it later. I would like to introduce to you our guest moderator, Vanesa Mercado Diaz, Master of Human Rights graduate from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. The focus of her research is women's rights, migration, and Latin America, and she wants to begin a career in the prevention of gender-based violence and femicide. She is currently a graduate researcher with the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Nazifa, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm truly honored to be able to have this conversation with our amazing panelists, which are Comfort Dondo and Rosario de la Torre. Comfort Dondo is a current PhD candidate with St. Mary's University. Her area of focus is leadership and policy development analysis. She is the founding executive director of Phumulani, African Women Against Violence. It is a culturally specific agency that serves African women in the diaspora. Its areas of focus are gender-based violence prevention and advocacy for policy changes to be more inclusive and equitable. Comfort currently sits on the governor's task force ending violence in Minnesota, and also consults with local, national, and international agencies, including the United Nations, UN Women, UNFP, and with the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, the city of Minneapolis, and the city of Brooklyn Park here in Minnesota, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. Her work includes advising the Black diaspora policy agenda on ending child sexual abuse, lobbying in partnership with the Washington, D.C. and New York Rape Crisis Center, among other organizations. And they are drafting policies that will change how child sexual abuse is responded to by law enforcement. In her spare time, Comfort is a co-host on 2 local TV shows in Minnesota, Women of the World and Empire Radio TV show. She openly engages with the African diaspora and work around ending gender-based violence by engaging men and youth as preventative measures. She is a mother to 3 children, a 10-year-old son, and a set of 7-year-old twins. So our second panelist is Rosario de la Torre. She is the co-director of family advocacy and community engagement for Casa de Esperanza, an organization whose mission is to mobilize Latinas and Latino communities to end domestic violence. Rosario has been in this position for 19 years. Rosario is an experienced advocate in the areas of domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and victimization. A responsive and accomplished professional, she has demonstrated leadership and organizational skills. Her success, in part, is a testimony to her communication skills, both among her staff and across the organization. She has vast experience in training, nationally and internationally, in areas of Latinx advocacy, court advocacy, and crisis line management. She is a highly respected and experienced advocate. So with that, thank you so much to our panelists, and we can begin with the conversation with a couple of questions. So the first question that we have for our panelists is, could you tell us about the importance of culturally competent and culturally centered domestic violence responses and services?
I can start. Thank you. Gracias. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. Like you said in my bio, I've been working with Casa de Esperanza this time around for 19 years, but I started back in 1992. And I work as an advocate. And when I was an advocate from, Casa de Esperanza has been in existence for almost 40 years now. And back in the day, Casa de Esperanza was founded by 5 courageous Latinas who needed to really provide the support and services to survivors of domestic violence in the Latinx community. With that being said, Casa de Esperanza was a Latina shelter for domestic violence survivors, but was providing a very traditional, you will, model, was a very traditional model, and providing services to the survivors of domestic violence, Latinos from the Latina community and the non-Latina community. So what we have learned throughout the years is that providing advocacy and support services for survivors of domestic violence, gender violence in the Latinx community is much more than just doing traditional services. So throughout the history of Casa de Esperanza, there's been a lot of changes and evolution. Casa de Esperanza is a very strong organization that went from being a domestic violence organization to a Latinx organization that is a Latina organization working with survivors of gender violence. What that means is that Casa de Esperanza center its services and approaches in the Latino realities. We created very different ways of providing advocacy because we know that in order for us to be effective with our community, we need to know the reality of our survivors. And we have Latina women leading the work of Casa de Esperanza because we believe in the strength of the community. We believe in the reality that, survivors who come to our program are the ones who know the reality of their own lives and their own experiences. So for any organization who is culturally relevant, I think the main thing is to listening to the community, understand, acknowledge, and honor the communities they're working with to be able to be more effective in providing services. So for Casa de Esperanza, it's one of the key elements is to be, to listen to the community, to learn from the community, and to evolve based on the community needs and the community strengths.
This is Comfort. I'll go next. And I'm sorry I'm not able to go on video in a little while. But to add on to what my fellow panelist, Ms. Rosario said, I do believe that culturally relevant, culturally specific services are vital on ending gender-based violence, because the solutions on any social issues actually lie within the communities that are heavily impacted. The solutions cannot come from the outside. And we have seen this time and again. I'll give an example in our community, the African immigrant community. We have seen a high homicide rates for women because they are sometimes opposed to going to mainstream shelters because they believe some of the mainstream shelters do not cater to their cultural needs. It can be as basic as maybe even just the kind of foods that are being fed to their children, or some of the cultural norms that are not observed in those spaces. So women tend not to want to go to those mainstream shelters. Hence, increasing their risk of going back to the abuser and then getting killed. And so as a community, the African immigrant community specifically, we came together 2015 and we did a extensive research. I think interviewed at least 300 domestic abuse survivors and victims. And the answers were consistent with the fact that the cultural communities that are impacted by any issue usually always have the solutions. They just need to be given the opportunity to say it in their own language, to say it in their own ways, and then have that be given to the policymakers so that they're able to draft policies that actually can serve back the community. And unfortunately, we've seen that, due to things like racism, white supremacy, it has always been the other way around. It has always been solutions coming from the top to the bottom. And that does not work, as we have seen in this movement. I guess with that, for me, that is why I think it's absolutely critical to have the voices of the communities impacted by any social issue in the middle of the conversation, and also at the least.
I think she might have been cut off. We can come back if she jumps back on. Did you want to add anything, Rosario? Or?
No, I mean, I totally agree with Comfort. I think one of the things that why Casa de Esperanza has been evolving, and during this 40 years is because we believe that, our philosophy as our mission is mobilize Latino communities to end domestic violence. And I think that's kind of echo what Comfort was mentioning about, the community has the answer for their, we have an answer for our issues, if you will. I don't like the word issue, but that's what it is, right? Our problems are also our opportunities as well. I remember Lupe Serrano, one of the directors, that when we make the whole change in the direction of the organization, she said you start with problems, right? With challenges, you ending up with programs, but you start with the strength. And you ending up with opportunities. So for us, treating the community as the experts and, really embracing that strength and the survivor and the resiliency of our community is how we really see the positive impact in dealing with domestic violence and many other issues and gender violence affecting our communities.
Yes, I think both of you mentioned really important aspects of centering that survivor experience. Is there, just to go a little bit more off of that, are there any specific initiatives or strategies that you all do that inform the work that you do specifically regarding the survivor experience?
We do different, we have a couple different things. One is our, that we collect from survivors for participants who are part of our receive services from Casa de Esperanza, because we need to know specifically about services and advocacy. What can we do better? What are the realities of our communities? What are the things that are changing within our community? How we need to adjust and adapt to some of the new nuances in the community, right? So we have an evaluation for survivors who come to a program, and we ask things about, challenges and opportunities, based on services and advocacy. But one very important component of Casa de Esperanza is to our community engagement. Our initiative is what we call Fuerza Unida, United Strength. And through that initiative, we conducted different listening sessions with the community at large. Because in order for us to really be effective in working with the community, with the Latinx community, we need to know what are the reality for the community, the general community. Because one thing that, at Casa de Esperanza, we hope to do is that anybody from the community who is facing difficult times with gender violence and is having, to look for services will feel comfortable doing that. So we need to be present at the community. We need to be part of the community. So in one of the first listening sessions back in 1999, for example, what we learned from the community, from women and the main areas, Minneapolis and St. Paul, through the listening sessions, is the Latinas wanted to see more the presence of the organization in the community. Right? When Casa de Esperanza started, and, Laura, you've been, doing this work for many years as well. It was very, all the domestic violence programs were very secretive, right? Location was very confidential. We will still having that, but the programs, the domestic violence program will perceive and view in the community as, this place where just, was separating families and breaking marriages and telling women to do things and they were not wanted to do. And we learned from the community by that they needed Casa de Esperanza to be in the community, to be part of the community, because we all are part of the solution. What we learned through the listening sessions as well is that the community wanted to be part of the change, right? That was in Casa de Esperanza's role. Our mission, I believe, back in the day was the Casa was access to end domestic violence. It was a very ambitious mission, right? And great mission. But the reality is that as an organization, we can do that alone. And what we learned from the community also is in the community wanted to see more resources, the community for the community by the community, because the stressors are, one of the key elements that, provoke domestic violence incidences. Stressors are, very high in our community, particularly the new immigrant community. So we learn those things and we adjust and we change some of the initiatives that we initially had. As I mentioned, we had a very traditional model, very mainstream model, and we needed to change that and totally shift the approach and working with our survivors and the Latinx community.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, you really encompass that really well, of how this traditional model just might work generally, but with different communities, different pockets of populations, it just isn't enough. And with that, I think, as you talked about a little bit too, some of these challenges impact communities different too. So what types of challenges or difficulties are communities facing that exacerbate gender-based violence? So maybe things like, as we've seen recently with immigration status or COVID-19, education, all of these things. So anything within those areas.
I think I can speak to this, for a couple of hours, but I'm going to concentrate in the realities that, perhaps if we think about COVID-19 and how everything changed in the last year or so, we have seen how our communities, any community, is facing so many challenges, right? Employment, housing, services for the Latinx communities, and particularly for the new immigrants and for undocumented survivors, is even more than that. And I'm going to talk, for survivors of domestic violence, but also for families, just any families that, one thing that come to mind, just in a very simple example of how impacted our communities are, that it may be different than the other communities, is that if you are an immigrant, you are a family of, who is undocumented, who are new immigrants and are facing some of these challenges because COVID-19, right? We know that many community members work in industries that are, the food industry, the cleaning industry, and they lost their jobs. And some of us that are citizens or residents or have a legal status in this country, we receive some remedies, right? Financial support from the government. You think about that undocumented, families that we work with, they don't qualify for a lot of this remedies. So there's, resources that are, a lot of times people don't think about it. You just give it for granted. If I'm a family of under, like in the poverty level that you will, there is some resources available, but with those resources, there's some requirements. And a lot of times our families don't fulfill those requirements. So on top of all the challenges that we see with any other communities, for the immigrant communities, for the Latinx community, for the undocumented, it's even more than that. The whole sense of, people say anti-immigrant sentiment, I think for our communities, the anti-immigrant reality that we are facing based in fortunately that is changing and I hope continues to change. But that's a big reality, right? That the resources that are available for some of the families, they are from this country or from this, they are documented, not available for undocumented families. Employment is huge. Legal assistance, housing is one of the biggest challenges that our families face just in general. That when we talk about affordable housing, for me, that, was so like, no, we don't have affordable housing. That's a concept that it doesn't exist in Minnesota. And I think it's just across the country in general.
Was there any type of different changes or challenges your center had to adapt to especially with COVID-19 this past year?
Oh, yes. One thing that I can say about, we had a meeting that it was actually a Zoom webinar about reflection of the last years, and it's a little bit over a year now. When I will say two things. One is that our services never stop. We continue to have our shelter program open, continue with different new different ways, right, of providing services. We have to be very conscious of the distance, the social distancing, and making sure that the residents and the advocates have the equipment to be able to be in the same place. And I'm saying PPE equipment mainly. And so our shelter program was open 24/7 as usual. I will say that one of the biggest challenges in that is that the stays at the shelter were a little bit longer because everything changed in March, right? So some of the participants who had employment and they were to move into their own place, they were residents at the refugio, they probably needed to change everything, right? And they were ending up staying longer. For our advocacy initiative, we have advocates working from home. And I think learning how to do that and adapting to that, it was also very difficult, not only for Casa de Esperanza advocates, but for any other advocacy programs. We started to providing services via Zoom and via phone. And we also needed to think about what are the safe ways to continue being connected with survivors if everybody is at home, right? And one thing that we learned is that because of the pandemic and what people were experiencing at home, the volume of cases is much higher than prior to COVID, because it's so many factors that influence in that. But I can think that one is that people, families were staying at home all together. So imagine those stressors in a family setting, right? From the parents to be working to be a teacher or a tutor, or helping their children to learn distance, to learn how to help them to be at home learning. What do you call that? Learning, distance learning, I'm sorry. I blank on that, distance learning, and not knowing the language and not knowing how to access all these platforms to help your children to continue education. So a lot of those things change in our participants' life and the families that we work with, and also impacted us as advocates. We had to make our house our office, our dining table our desk, that convert into a dining table after 5 probably. So I think we learned a lot during COVID. We learned how to be flexible. We learned how to support each other. We learned how to take care of ourselves, but also how to be available to take care of our communities, and being very, very flexible in the way we provide services. And we are very creative, I will have to tell you. I think as an organization, and organizations working with gender violence, we have to be very creative, very innovative, and very flexible. Because domestic violence, gender violence doesn't stop.
Yes, thank you for all that. We are nearing the time for questions. So right now, if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. And hopefully Comfort will rejoin us and answer some of these as well. And we also have other questions if we don't see any popping.
I do see one question in the chat. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Wilson. It's great to be here with you, Rosario and Vanesa. And thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us so far. So I see a question. Are there culturally specific batterer intervention programs available for offenders in the Latinx community?
I'm sure. I mean, I can speak to Casa de Esperanza is a national organization, right? I just happen to be local, and I am in charge of the local initiative, the intervention part of the, the services of Casa de Esperanza. We particularly do not have programming for batterers, per se. I know there across the country, there is some that are very specific to different, cultural groups, and I can find that information for you. We work with organizations that may not be culturally relevant, but they are working and providing the services to very specific communities for batterers. What we have in Casa de Esperanza in the prevention part of the work is that about 2-3 weeks ago, we created our Men and Boys engagement and voice in gender violence, because we believe that, one of the things that we hear from the community is, yes, you have services for, women and children, women and girls even, right? Back in the day, I'm talking about back in the day. And one thing that we hear is, what about our boys? What about our partners? What about, community members who want to be part of the solution, want to be part of the change, and they just don't know how to get involved. So Casa de Esperanza, and what we learn also by having those groups and this, gatherings, is that, gender violence, and I don't want to say it in any specific culture, but it's one thing that people don't think about. I'm perpetrating violence, right? A lot of times it's something that has been learned, and we know that domestic violence, it has, it's a behavior that was learned, that can be unlearned. So we use those opportunities to really engage the community in general to unlearn some of those behaviors. And men and boys have to be in those conversations. So we see that from this prevention part of the work.
That's such a great point. And it's something that I think is really unique about Casa de Esperanza that I've admired for a long time, and that we see really around the world, more of a recognition of the role of men and boys, and the need, to focus on changing beliefs, changing, learned behaviors, things like that. So thank you for that, Rosario. I see a couple of other questions. One is, have you noticed any significant change in the amount of reports from your CPS or legal authorities, so Child Protective Services, since the start of the pandemic? And this is Jeanette Orozco. She says, here we have noticed a much lower number of referrals, especially from our immigrant families, despite knowing that the concerns for safety are rising at home. Do you have any recommendations for how to reach out to these families who might not be getting representation?
It's very interesting, but we haven't seen, and I think prior to the pandemic, we started to see an increased number of cases that, were involved in child protection services. And I don't have numbers, unfortunately, right now, but what is my sense for my check-in and my everyday work with advocates is that we have seen the number of cases increase. There is, there are involved child protection cases, and it's very sad to say it. And again, I don't want to say numbers because I don't want to say something that is not, it's real, I just don't have the numbers, but we see more of the sexual violence cases involving children. And it seems to be, growing. And I can have a couple different things for what that happened, that I think it happens because the one good thing, and I wanted to think that's why it's happening, is because people know more about services and more about resources. And I think the more you are out in the community and the people know that we exist, and the service providers and systems know that we exist, the more likely we're going to be involved, and the more likely we're going to be able to support families when situations like this happen. And it was something about suggestions. Can you repeat that, Laura?
Sure. Yeah. So the comment was that they've noticed a much lower number of referrals, especially from immigrant families. I'm assuming this is maybe during COVID-19. Do you have any recommendations for how to reach out to these families?
No, what we are being very creative with the way we do our reach to the community. We do it in very different ways. What we learned perhaps with our community is then being present. We do a lot of informal check-ins with, through social media, through not only social media, but even through different activities in the community. One thing that it was very important for me working with Casa de Esperanza during COVID is that the Latinx community organizations come together. And we formed this network for 59 statewide organizations to address. Initially it was COVID-19, right? It's like, what do we do? All these things are happening with their families, but it was above and beyond just one thing. So I think being able to be, communicating to each other, if somebody has a Facebook Live, perhaps what we're doing right now is to reiterate and to let families know that we are available, that the services haven't stopped, that, confidentiality is still, and safety is still one of our main points, when we work with survivors of domestic violence, be available for the school systems. A lot of the students, and hopefully that will change as we continue to deal with, COVID-19, going back to a school, letting teachers and school systems know that we are available, that we're still here. People, in the very beginning, people will ask those questions. Is CASA still open? Are advocacy still available? And the reality is that none of those organizations ever stop services. And like I mentioned before, the numbers have increased. So I think it's continued to letting the community know that we're still available, and the services are here, and the advocates are 24/7, are always willing and able to listen and to have a conversation and think about safety in a very different way. It's very important. And I welcome, I could disclose some of those strategies, but I think I won't do that. But we have to adapt. And how do we do the safety planning with survivors during COVID?
Thank you very much. I see that Comfort has rejoined, but I can't tell. Is your internet connection working, Comfort? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm so sorry about that. We've been having some issues all morning, so thank you, but I've rejoined. I might not be able to get my camera on. I don't know what's going on, but then I'm here. So
that's okay. Welcome back, Vanessa. Would you like to pose one of those earlier questions for Comfort?
Yeah, of course. We touched on a little bit of different topics, but I think the main parts of it were that what types of challenges are communities facing regarding gender-based violence, and how are those responses also culturally specific, including like responses with COVID-19, education, immigration status. So any of those areas that you might want to share with us.
Absolutely, Vanessa. And yeah, thank you. Since COVID-19 hits the globe 2020 March, we also see a significant rise in domestic violence calls I think for me, I would call it, a pandemic within a pandemic itself. I think it's really, COVID-19 really showed some of the stresses that we would know are already there in our community. So I will give a few scenarios. Some of the challenges our communities face is the historical distrust of any governmental systems. And so I'll speak for African immigrant women that I will work with. Most of them are coming from war-torn countries. They already don't trust the government. And so we've been seeing a lot of hesitancy to report. And then because of what COVID-19 has done, it's caused a lot of more isolation. So for instance, the mainstream domestic violence shelters that we normally refer women to had at some point had to close down and or have women in hotels to facilitate the social distancing. Well, if they're in the motel, it's another stressor for them because they are in isolation. Unlike when they're in shelter, they're together with other women or in group. So that's really made it a little bit more challenging. The second part for us has also been trying to work with the police departments, specifically mostly the Minneapolis Police Department, and for me, it's Brooklyn Center Police Department, and just educating them, which has really been a bit challenging because change is really hard, but educating them on how sometimes even the police departments themselves are used by abusers to further abuse the victims. So these are some of the main things that we've seen. And of course, with COVID-19, a lot of the women we work with have lost. Some of them have lost their work. A lot of them are in the hair braiding, salon type of work. They've lost their work, and so I think I mentioned earlier on the reluctancy to go to shelter. I think with what Ms. Rosario's agency does, Casa de Esperanza, is the same model for our culturally specific communities where women really do not want to go to shelter, but they want to be supported from where they are. They want to stay in community. So when women lose their jobs, then they're at the verge of losing their apartments. So we've seen our work going from the prevention of gender-based violence really to honing in on homelessness prevention, which on its own is a whole monster to fight, as you all know with the numbers. So I think in short, I would say COVID-19 has really brought to light a lot of the issues we know already exist for historically marginalized communities that we serve, but it's done so in a way where it's a pandemic. There's a lot of pressure, but I have to say I've been very proud I've been very proud of how Minnesota as a state has responded. I'll acknowledge the Department of Human Services, the governor the Office of the Governor, among other agencies, Minnesota Department of Health. They've been really supportive, but again, we still see those disparities. And so those are just a few. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
If I can add to what confirmation about the services, one thing that we have learned so many things, right, in the evolution of Casa de Esperanza, but one of the reasons why we changed from being just a traditional model of being a shelter program to work in community and have community-based advocates or what is called now mobile advocacy. It was that's one of the main things that we heard from the community. We need the presence of advocates in the community. And that change happened back in 1998. Is nothing that is new. I think a lot of the programs that are doing gender-based violence are now kind of taking that model of doing community advocacy, which I always kind of also want to say that it looks very different than Casa de Esperanza and what Comfort program does, and being present at meet people where they are at, not having an advocate in a public place. No, that's a different kind of community advocacy, because what we know is that 99% of the survivors we work with do not want to leave the relationship. They want the domestic violence to stop. So for us to, when we say we present in the community and we meet participants or survivors where they're at, we mean meet them where they are at their houses, at the school where their children go to, at the clinic they go to, at the coffee shop. That's the only place they have some freedom to go to. So that's a very important approach that Casa de Esperanza has ever since 1998. And it's one of the best ways for us to provide advocacy. Because again, that's what we know from the community. That's what we learn from the community survivors. That's why they needed the advocate presence in the community. And I'm gonna add one thing that my colleague just sent me a text, and I'm gonna give credit to her, my co-director, Iveda Isea, is that la oportunidad, I don't know how I forget that, para la oportunidad in Minneapolis provides services for butters who are, from the Latinx community. So in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, we do have programming for Latinx butters of, who perpetrate domestic violence. I just want to make that clarification. Thank you.
Vanessa, we do have a lot more questions in the chat now. So I know we only have about 4 more minutes. I'm going to try to combine 2 of these and ask you both if you could comment on how it's domestic and sexual assault or abuse agencies that are, the words used here are agencies in rural white America, but I would expand that to urban and suburban. It's also applicable, or more organizations that are more mainstream, perhaps more have more power and privilege within the current systems. How can those organizations act as culturally responsive allies to organizations such as yours or to immigrant communities?
I'm gonna let you respond to that, Comfort, and then I can add. I see that you unmute.
Sure, yeah. Wow, I think one of the things that we would desire for like a true working a collaborative partnership would be genuinely stepping aside and allow the capacity building of culturally specific organizations, including the support for them to accessing resources that are meant for culturally specific programs. I'll give an example, and I think Ms. Rosario would agree with me on this one. I'm putting on the spot. I think, for example, if we're having funding that is designated to culturally specific programs, let's as mainstream programs, let's make sure we give support to the culturally specific programs to attain as much of those resources over, let's say, hiring culturally specific advocates in our programs that are already at a capacity that is higher, because we know historically culturally specific programs reflect the marginalized communities from where they come from. That is, our capacity is not as well built. We are working on fumes most of the time, just because of the way the system is set up. And I'm not going to go into the systemic, racism talks here. But I think for me, true allyship is really what I would also like to shout out to the Violence Free Minnesota Executive Director, Liz Richards. She has exemplified that in my journey, where she really has stepped in as a leader and actually hold hands of our program as a culturally newer program. And whenever there's resources for culturally specific programs, she has really been supporting that we grow our capacity that way. For me, this is what true allyship is. True allyship is not just in the talking, it is actually in the doing, I think. And then I think the second thing is also being open, removing attachments from the old ways of doing things. And what I mean this is, we know that the mainstream programs, probably some of them have been around longer. And there's always this, this is how we've always done things, right? Which I understand. But I think being open to knowing that the demographics are changing, even if we look in our children, with the generations, it's changing. And we have to continue to be open to new ways of being, to new ways of doing things. So yeah, I think those are the 2 things I would really commend mainstream programs to continue to be open, because if we look outside our windows, demographics are shifting. There's different waves of immigrants that have come into our spaces. And I think if we are open, we'll be able to actually support. And coming in with, what can we learn from you? How can we support over, this is how things have always been done. Yeah, I'm confident I'm done speaking. No, thank you.
And I know we can at that time is up, but I totally agree with everything you said, my friend, but I also will add not to be afraid of ask. I think that's one of the biggest things that we have experienced is that, really trust those organizations that are culture relevant and let have them being part of those conversations at the very beginning. One of the things that we always experience is that sometimes they bring you to the table when everything is already done. It's that, it's a done deal, right? And they want to have this organization to just sign off on something that they have created without really utilizing the expertise and experience of those organizations. And I think one of the things that is very effective is that, having the same experiences that organizations that work with very specific communities, is that we can relate to a lot of that. We work very closely with organizations that Asian Women United. We work very closely with, Comfort. She will call me and said, okay, what do you think? This is what we see. And what is your, experience working in the Latinx community? Really helping each other, supporting each other, but not wait until you really see in this huge Latinx community in this suburban area and you just wanted to out of nowhere, create programming when you don't know the reality of your community or the community you are serving or the community you are about to provide services to. That's very important. And the other thing is that meaningful collaborations are very important. But the meaningful, and what that means and how that look like, it's very, very important to really have those critical conversations. It's just not about having somebody at the table to say, okay, we're working with the Latinx community, right? But how we let this communities and community organizations lead their work, because the experience the experience we have comes from our community. I just did not wake up today saying, "Oh, I'm an expert in a community, the Latinx community." It's years and years and years of experience and learning from our communities what is effective and what works and what doesn't work.
Thank you. There are some other great questions in the chat, and what I think we can do is we'll save those questions and share them with you, Rosario and Comfort. And if you have time to give feedback, that's wonderful. But we really appreciate all of your time today, and I'll turn it over to Vanesa to.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rosario and Comfort, for all of your knowledge and wisdom that you shared with us today. Yeah, I think we are good to close out if any of you two have any closing remarks or anything. But yeah, thank you so much and everyone who attended today and took the time to be here.
I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. I think it's always great to share with my colleagues and friends, and we are here in the same boat. And I think the only way that we're gonna end this gender violence by working together. That's the only way. And I'm very happy to be here. So thank you. Gracias.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Vanesa. Thank you so much, Laura, for moderating the questions in the chat. It has been wonderful. We are so grateful to hear from you. And once again, this was recorded. So in a few days, you will be receiving a link to the recording and additional resources. So thank you, everyone.